Hi, good evening.
Okay. Hi, good evening to everyone. Okay, so tonight we are continuing in Perek. Let me just mute everybody, but if anybody wants to speak up, please unmute yourselves and do so. Okay, so we are continuing in the next section in chapter 2 of Yeshayahu. Okay, so let's briefly read it again, and we'll um, go through what we spoke about last time, and then continue to try to go more in depth on this passage. So Yeshayahu starts off here in Pasuk A, verse number 5 in chapter 2. Beit Yaakov lechu v'nelcha be'or Adonai, O house of Jacob, come let us walk by the light of the Lord. So we mentioned last time the explanation of Rashi here that this is a reference to the previous section. In other words, in the previous prophecy of Yeshayahu about the end of the days and all the nations saying that they want to come to Yerushalayim, lechu v'na'aleh l'har Beit Hashem. So Yeshayahu is now calling out to his people, before we reach that stage of the entire world coming to see the light of the words of Hashem in Yerushalayim, first of all, it is incumbent upon us, house of Jacob, as ourselves, that we should go by the light of God. Why? Because currently we are not doing so. Okay, and that's what he says in the next verse. Ki natashta amcha beit Yaakov, ki mal'u mikedem ve'onenim kaplishtim uve'lodeim nachrim yaspiku. Okay, for you are forsaken the ways of your people, O house of Jacob, for they are full of practices from the east and of soothsaying like the Philistines. They abound in customs of the aliens. I don't know if aliens is the right word, maybe better translated as foreigners. Okay, in other words, that they've been following the Beit Yaakov, the house of Jacob, instead of following the Torah and the light of Hashem, instead they're following the practices of the other nations around them, all of these soothsayers and in all the customs. Now, there's a bit of a question. What does it mean exactly here when it says Ki natashta amcha Beit Yaakov? Okay, who is this exactly referring to? Is it referring that the Jewish people have forsaken the ways of their people? Okay, which is the way here the translator explained it, the translator from the Sephora website. If you look at Rashi, though, he understands it a little bit differently. Rashi says, Ki natashta amcha Beit Yaakov, הנביא מסב הדיבור אל השכינה, ואומר כי ידהנה עזבת את עמך בשביל עוונם. In other words, according to Rashi, when the prophet says, Ki natashta amcha Beit Yaakov, he's actually turning back to God, and he said, you, God, have forsaken your people. But why have you forsaken your people? It is not without reason. Rather, it is because in other words, because they have adopted all these practices of these superstitions, soothsaying, etc., all these various things that were practiced by the idolatrous nations around them, then that is why you have forsaken your people. Okay, so you could read it, I think, in both ways here. This phrase of Kinatash Tamcha Beit Yaakov. Okay, now come three, or two or three very interesting verses, which we'll try to analyze a bit more in depth. Okay, and it says here, "Vatimale arzo kesef v'zahav, ve'ein ketze le'otzrotav, vatimale arzo susim, ve'ein ketze lamerkevotav." So their land is full of silver and gold. There is no limit to their treasures. Their land is full of horses. There is no limit to their chariots. ותמלא ארצו אלילים, למעשה ידיו ישתחוו, לאשר עשו אצבעותיו. And their land is full of idols. They bow down to the work of their hands, to what their own fingers have wrought. Okay? Now just tell me, looking at these two verses, which phrase or which two words repeat themselves? Or maybe there are several phrases that repeat themselves in these verses. Okay, Flora says, "Vatimale arzo." Notice, very good. Notice that the word "vatimale arzo," and indeed, the phrase I'm putting in bold so you can see, appears 3 times. ותמלא ארצו.
And ketz.
And the other phrase that appears also twice is
And ketz.
the en ketze.
Or ketze, סליחה.
Ketze, there's no limit. It appears on the first two, it doesn't appear on the third one. Okay, so what are the things that so the land is full, there's no limit to? In other words, all these phrases come to say that there's an abundance of something. Now, what is there an abundance of?
From doing.
Okay, there are three things that we have an abundance of. Here, what are they?
Idols.
Oh,
you have idols here in verse number 8. Very good. So
silver and kesef v'zahav.
We have kesef v'zahav right here.
And susim.
Treasures.
They're all things for war. You need them.
Sorry, who said that?
These are all items you need for war.
Julia, very good. Yes. I mean, there's one that you're right. Well, I don't know if you need the idols for war. I guess they thought they did.
Yeah.
But what is the actually? You're very good about the war part. What is the actually out of the three things? What is really the one that was the mainly used for war in those times?
Horses.
Horses, exactly.
Yeah.
Horses. We'll discuss it a bit at length, but horses are like the equivalent of what would be a tank in a modern day army, right? Horses and chariots, they were instruments of war back in those days. So very good. Okay. So again, just to show it on the screen. So Yeshayahu is describing very clearly the land being full of gold and silver and gold, horses, and I guess we should add here also kesef v'zahav. The parallel to kesef v'zahav is otzrotav, treasures, horses and chariots. Here also the chariots being complementing the horses, and the idols, which are then referred to as lemaseh adav yishtachavu la'asher asu etzbeotav, they bow down to the work of their hands, to what their own fingers have wrought. Okay, now, what is the result of all of this? What is the sort of the response of God to all of this? So that's the next verses 9 through 11, which basically can be summed up in very quickly that God will now humble man. In other words, the result of the land being filled with gold, silver, treasures, horses, chariots, is idols, but the idols are essentially really, man is now worshiping instead of worshiping Hashem. When the man is worshiping idols, who is he really worshiping? Okay, we discussed that last time. The man is really worshiping himself. In other words, what we really have here is the haughtiness of man who believes that all of this is the result of his own powers. And therefore, the response of God to this is, but man shall be humbled, and mortal brought low. Oh, do not forgive them. Go deep into the rock, bury yourselves in the ground before the terror of the Lord and his dread majesty. Man's haughty shall be brought low, and the pride of mortals shall be humbled. None but the Lord shall be exalted in that day. So very clearly, the response is, it doesn't exactly say what will happen precisely, but whatever it is will bring about the humbling of man, who now sort of believes that he's on the top of the mountain, he's got all these treasures, very powerful horses, chariots, idols, etc., and man will be humbled. Okay, now, we mentioned last time, what time in history does this seem to be referring to? What time in history do we know that that the kingdom of Yehuda and Yerushalayim, or all of Israel, were filled with gold and silver, filled with the horses and chariots, and ultimately filled with idols? When did this all occur?
Shlomo HaMelech's time.
Very good. In the times of Shlomo HaMelech. Okay. So this is what the Radak, in his commentary here on Yeshayahu, points out, that these verses seem to be a clear reference to the times of Shlomo. Okay, he says here in his commentary on Pasuk Zayin, on verse 7, in other words, the land of the people which you have forsaken, אמר כאשר נתמלאה ארצו כסף וזהב וסוסים עד שאין סוף לאוצרותיו ולמרכבותיו, אז נתמלאה ארצו אלילים. In other words, verse number 8, the land being filled with idols, is a result of verse number 7. In other words, as a result of verse number 7, having all this gold, silver, horses, and chariots, that the result of that was the land being filled with idols. What's the connection? So he says, כמו שאמר, וישמן ישורון ויבט. Right, the famous story from Sefer Dvarim, Yeshurun is Israel, has become fatty, in other words, has become rich, and therefore Vayivat has become rebellious. It's kicking back against the master. ואמר וכסף הרביתי לה וזהב עשו לבעל. Right, that God gave us plentiful, and instead of worshiping Hashem, they took it to worship the Baal, which is one of the forms of idolatry, which was common at the time. וזה היה בימי שלמה, שהייתה ארץ ישראל מלאה כסף וזהב. This was in the times of King Solomon. At that time, the land of Israel was filled with gold, silver and gold. כמו שכתוב, ויתן שלמה את הכסף בירושלים כאבנים. Right, that the silver in the times of Shlomo HaMelech in Yerushalayim was like stones. This wasn't because of inflation, like you have in Venezuela nowadays, where you have the cash rolling on the street because it's worthless. No, to the contrary, they were so rich that the silver was so plentiful. וכן זהב לרוב שהיו מביאים לו מאופיר ומממלכת שבא ומכל המלכים. Right, they also had an abundance of gold because he was doing commerce, with all these nations around in Africa, etc. The same story with Queen Sheba. So that's why Yerushalayim was so rich at that time. וסוסים, כמו שכתוב, היו לו 40,000 אורוות סוסים, 40,000 stalls of horses, incredible amount. ובימי שלמה החלו לעשותם, ולעבוד להם, ואף בחייו החלו לעשות, כמו שכתוב. In the days of Shlomo, they began to make the idols and worship them, even while he was still alive. ופירושו ואין קצב ואין סוף, כלומר אין סוף למספרם, infinity, והוא דרך הפלגה. In other words, it's an exaggeration just to say that there were so many of them. Obviously, there weren't an infinite amount, but it's coming to say that there was a very large amount. Now, the question is as follows. Yeshayahu, as we said, is speaking in the times of Uzziah. Uzziah is a good number of generations after Shlomo, okay? So what's going on here? Why is he sort of now rebuking them for things that occurred in the times of Shlomo HaMelech? That was many, many generations ago. Shlomo received this punishment. Am Yisrael received this punishment. There's been a lot of water has passed in the Jordan River, as the expression goes, since that time. Okay, what is Yeshayahu now getting worked up again about what was so long ago in the times of Shlomo HaMelech? How is that relevant to the people of his generation in Uzziah? Okay, so apparently he's trying to draw some sort of parallel between what's going on now in the times of Uzziah and what happened in the times of Shlomo, right? Sort of as we say, why do we need to learn history? Because history is bound to repeat itself. Or as some people jokingly say, so that when you see history repeating itself, you'll be able to know that it's happening, but really there's very little you can do about it because history does tend to repeat itself. So, but in essence, Yeshayahu is trying to say to them, look what happened in the times of Shlomo, look at how that ended up, and something similar is happening now. Okay, that's essentially what I'll try to demonstrate. Okay, and I think that's why Yeshayahu is now bringing in this sort of description of the times of Shlomo HaMelech to the people in his time. Okay, but in order to understand that comparison, because we don't find, if we look at the times of Uzziah, we don't exactly find all these horses, all these idols. Okay, So the comparison to the times of Shlomo Melech, we do know, as we learned when we started the background to Sefer Yeshayahu, that the times of Uzziah was a time of wealth, of expansion of borders. So there was a lot of this stuff going on at the time, but we don't exactly find, the many horses, the many gold and silver that we find in the times of Shlomo Melech. So to try to better understand what the comparison to the times of Shlomo Melech, we have to really understand what the problem is with having many horses, what the problem is with having so much gold and silver, what's the problem with these things, okay? And once we sort of try to understand that, then we'll be able to figure out what was going wrong in the times of Uzziah as well. Okay, so to figure all this out, we have to go back to Sefer Dvarim again. As we often say, Yeshayahu likes to draw upon Sefer Dvarim, as he has done so, as we have shown in a number of places already. And we have to go back to Sefer Dvarim. Sefer Dvarim, we have a short parasha which details the special commandments for a king. And we'll look at that. We'll try to analyze what that is about. Okay. So let's take a look. This is in Sefer Dvarim, chapter 17, verses 14 through 20. It says as follows: כי תבואי לארץ, אשר אדוני אלוהיך נותן לך, וירשת וישבת בה, ואמרת שימה עלי מלך ככל הגויים אשר סביבותיי. Okay, if after you've entered the land that the Lord your God has assigned to you and taken possession of it and settled it, you decide, I will set a king over me as do all the nations about me. שום תשים עליך מלך, אשר יבחר אדוני אלוהיך בו, מקרב אחיך תשים עליך מלך, לא תוכל לתת עליך איש נוכרי אשר לא אחיך הוא. Okay, you shall be free to set a king over yourself, one chosen by the Lord your God. Be sure to set as king over yourself one of your own people. You must not set a foreigner over you, one who is not your kinsman. Okay, so the first commandment is the person that you're appointing king must be mikerev achecha, from your own people. Okay, now we have the commandments to the king. רק לא ירבה לו סוסים, ולא יושיב את העם מצרימה, למען הרבות סוס. ואדוני אמר לכם, לא תוסיפון לשוב בדרך הזה עוד. Okay? Moreover, he shall not keep many horses, or send back people back to Egypt to add to his horses. Since the Lord has warned you, you must not go back that way again. Okay, in those times, all the high-quality horses were brought from Egypt, so therefore he should not keep too many horses, because that will bring people, you would have to send people to go and buy horses from Egypt, etc., and then that might cause a return to Egypt of the people. Next it says, ולא ירבה לו נשים ולא יסור לבבו, וכסף וזהב לא ירבה לו מאוד. And he shall not have many wives, lest his heart go astray, nor shall he amass silver and gold to excess. Okay, so not too many wives, because wives will lead him to go astray. Okay, we'll have to understand what that means. And he shall not amass silver or gold to excess. Okay, when he's seated on his royal throne, he shall have a copy of this teaching written for him on a scroll by the Levitical priests. Okay, in other words, according to our tradition, this means that he actually writes down an entire Sefer Torah. In other words, we have a commandment for every Jew to write a Sefer Torah, and the king actually has to have 2 Sifrei Torah. Sorry, there's a typo here. השם אלוקיו, לשמור את כל דברי התורה הזאת ואת החוקים האלה לעשותם. Let it remain with him and let him read in it all his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God, to observe faithfully every word of this teaching, as well as these laws. לבלתי רום לבבו מאחיו, ולבלתי סור מן המצווה ימין ושמאל, למען יאריך ימים על ממלכתו ובניו בקרב ישראל. Thus he will not act haughtily towards his fellows, or deviate from the instruction to the right or to the left, to the end that he and his descendants may reign long in the midst of Israel. Okay, so just looking here at these verses, what are the parallels that we have to Yeshayahu here? Okay, seems quite clear. What parallels do we have?
You haven't got the wives.
The wives are missing. Okay, but let's see. What
Yes.
do we have?
Everything else, yeah.
Yeah, the horses.
So we've got horses, not to abandon too many horses.
And the gold and silver.
Right? What else do we have?
Treasures.
I'm sorry?
Horses, gold and silver.
Yeah.
Gold and silver. Very good.
Horses, gold and silver.
Okay. What else do we have? Anything about the idols?
Yes.
Yes. What?
Yeah, you mustn't deviate.
Yes,
or the
lie
right.
right or the left. Yeah.
Right. One of the problems with Zoom, it's hard to hear multiple people at the same time. I'm sorry, Frank, you were saying something?
Deviate from the instructions to the right or to the left from the
Okay.
from the Torah.
You cannot deviate to instructions.
Yeah.
Anything more, which seems to be towards the idols besides obeying the instructions?
Oh yes,
Well,
of course,
it's
the wives.
separate. Well, not really.
The
No.
wives, because if you choose a wife from a foreign nation, which often happened and certainly did with Shlomo HaMelech, the idols with them.
Excellent. So you see here, lo yarbelo nashim velo yasru levavo. The women will cause the heart to go astray, like you said, very good, because the women that are referring to are women from other nations. We'll discuss exactly, that's precisely what happened with Shlomo, and we'll explain why it must be that way. Anything about the haughtiness?
Well, writing a Sefer Torah or having two, keeping treasury and one in a lot always with him in war shows that he has to keep all the mitzvot, and he hasn't. We found out later they have not kept the mitzvot. They obviously
Right.
the Melech did.
Yeah, obviously the king has to be super careful. But anything specifically about the haughtiness here?
About the what? Sorry.
Yeah, the Yeshayahu spoke about man needing to be humbled because he became too haughty. Okay, do we have anything about that regarding the king here?
That's
To
20.
revere
He
Hashem.
will not act according.
Yeah, very good. I think verse number 20. Levilti rum levavo me'echav. The concern about the king is that he will act haughtily and then deviate from the commandments. Okay, so really, we've got everything here as well. Okay, but we see it all, but we have to sort of understand it. Okay, so what's going on here? What's the story about the horses, the gold and the silver, the wines leading to the idolatry? What is all of this about? That's sort of what we have to try and figure out. Okay, so I think we mentioned in the past, anytime we're speaking about a kingdom or a government, what are the three most important offices in any government? If you I don't know how it works in the UK, but in Israel, it's very clear that at least it used to be in the past when they would have their coalition negotiations between the different parties, they would argue over the three, biggest office under prime minister, the three biggest offices, who would get them. In recent years, they've discovered
Treasury would be the
Yeah.
treasury.
Treasury.
Treasury, the
Treasury.
chancellor.
Foul.
What? One is treasury. Next one is also
Foreign ministry.
Yeah.
Foreign ministry.
Sar HaChutz, yeah.
Defense.
yeah. And the last one, the third,
Defense.
and defense. Okay, these are the three most important things in every government. Although it seems like in recent years, parties try to avoid these offices because they realize that with added responsibility, it causes criticism, and then they lose votes in the next elections. So sometimes they're not for these offices. But at least in the past, these were considered the three most prestigious offices. And really, they're the three most important things of the government. In other words, who's running the treasury, who's running the defense, and who's running foreign diplomacy. Now, if you look very clearly, this is what these three prohibitions are about. Okay, the horses are about what? The horses.
Foreign.
Defense.
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 Horses were
Defense.
war. So Rak lo yarbelu susim is a guidance to how to run your army, your defense policy. Kesef v'zahav obviously is about the
Treasury.
okay. For some reason, you would think that having a lot of gold and silver is good for the treasury, but too much can be bad. We have to figure that out why. Also, why too many horses is a bad idea. Seems like a good idea to have a very powerful army. And the third one, where do we have the foreign office here?
Well, that's the wives again, isn't it?
The wives, very good. I think we spoke a little bit about this in the past. The way foreign diplomacy was run in the past, and maybe in some places in the world to this day, is through marriage. In other words, if you wanted to broker a deal with another nation, the way you would do it is the daughter of one king would marry the other king. Okay, and really we know that's what Shlomo HaMelech was all about when he made all his 1,000 wives. It wasn't for his own personal pleasure, rather it was because his foreign diplomacy was so extensive that he took so many wives. So in essence, the Torah is limiting the behavior on these three very critical aspects. Don't get too many horses, don't get too much gold and silver, and don't engage in excess foreign diplomacy with other nations. Okay, now all of this does not seem very clear at first glance. Why not? All of these things seem to be good things. If you have a big and powerful army, that seems to be good. Okay, if you're very rich, that also seems to be good. If you have good foreign diplomacy with many nations, that also seems to be a good thing. I mean, at least that's what we normally think about a successful country. The question is, why is the Torah? Now, the Torah is not outlawing it. Obviously, the Torah recognizes that it's necessary, but it's putting a limitation on it. Rak lo yarbe. Don't do it too much, whatever that means. So the question is, what is this all about? And really, what are the alternatives that we have? Okay, so we'll try to go through all three to understand them. And I think we'll start with the...
excuse me. Is this a general warning against material possessions and attachment to wealth, power, women, as a warning that too much of all this will take you away from me, and a warning against material possessions, even for the king?
Yes, definitely the whole purpose of this is, like you said, that all of this will take man away from God. I mean, we don't find a specific prohibition by a private individual to have an excess of wealth. But certainly that is the concern also by private individuals. But so you are correct in general. I think that's definitely for sure the case. But I think we also have to sort of get into the details to understand precisely what it's about. In other words, we could say, yes, generally too much of this will lead man to become haughty, believe in his own powers, and that will lead them to go astray from God. That's certainly correct, and that's certainly very definitely the idea that's going on here. But I think if we also go and dig a little bit deeper into inside, we'll sort of see precisely what it means and sort of what are the alternatives that we do have, because we do want to have a successful state and a successful government.
Diane, could it be more that there's nothing wrong, as Diane rightly said, to have too much gold and silver? It's how you use it. You don't say kochi v'otzem yadi. You don't say it's all because of me, and that Yeshurim yivat vayeshmen Yeshurim v'yibat. He got fat and he kicked. Maybe that, I don't know. That's how I read it. I think Hashem doesn't mind if we have money, but he knows. He looks into the psyche and he sees that we're going to abuse it.
Right. I mean, that was sort of the thought of Shlomo HaMelech, that he'll be able to do it. That's what Chazal is saying.
Yeah.
That he'll be able to do it without, falling apart because of it. And ultimately, he wasn't successful in doing it. Okay.
Right.
That's why we sort of have to see what is precisely being prohibited here, and why what's being prohibited will sort of inevitably lead you down that road of leaving God. Why is that? How does all this occur? Okay, so let's start with the horses. Okay, the horses I think is really very interesting, because it sort of tells you, what's the army according to the Torah, according to the prophets. How should an army be structured? Okay, so if we look, let me just, before I go into the sources, if we just look today generally at armies, okay, we'll see that, I mean, I'm not a big expert in armies, but generally, you can see that there are two systems of how to run an army. You have what's called your regular army, what in Hebrew is called tzva sadir, which is the soldiers which are employed year-round as soldiers. And then you can have also reserve units, which are essentially people that have been trained as soldiers. Most of the year, they're living their own lives. They may be doing training once a year or whatever it is. And then in case of wartime, they can be called into battle. Now, some countries they don't have reserve units. They just have simply a very large regular army. And other countries might have a smaller regular army, but have many reserve units that they can call into battle in times of war when they need them. For example, Israel, the IDF, that's the way they run it. They have the regular army, they have a standard regular army, which is not so big, but then they have a lot of reserve units, which in times of war, chas v'chalila, then they can call upon these reserve units to come in. Okay, I can tell you that one of the happiest days of my life was when a few years ago, I was notified by the army that I would no longer be called into reserve duty. But even then, I still, for a few months afterwards, I would still have a nightmares that they've changed their minds and decided to call me back. Wait a second, I see there's a note here in the slide. Okay, I'm not sure, Sivan wrote here, I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to, where this other place is. Again, there is a certain amount of wives that he is allowed to own, but we'll discuss the wives later on, exactly what that means. So those are the two systems that you can have for the army. Which system, if we go into Tanakh, which system was used? So if we look, David HaMelech very clearly used a system of a smaller regular army and then reserve units. Okay, we can see this from several places. I just brought a few psukim as examples for this. Okay, here in source number 8 in Divrei Yamim Aleph, first book of Chronicles, chapter 27, are described the reserve units that David HaMelech had in his army. Okay, it says there, Uvnei Yisrael misparam, Rashei Avot v'Sarei Alafim v'Hameot v'Shotreihem, המשרתים את המלך לכל דבר המחלוקות, הבא ויוצאת חודש בחודש, לכל חודשי השנה, המחלוקת האחת 24,000. Okay, the number of Israelites, chiefs of clans, officers of thousands and hundreds, and their clerks, who served the king in all matters of the divisions, who worked in monthly shifts during all the months of the year, each division 24,000. Okay, so we have here the idea of a unit of 24,000, which served essentially a month, a year. Okay, you can read there the whole description of the system. Very similar to, if you look at the IDF nowadays, the reserve units generally, at least in the past, they used to serve approximately a month a year, hopefully less than that. But that's sort of the idea of a reserve unit. Okay, now we can also see this in the wars that David HaMelech conducted. For example, if we look in the book of Shmuel Bet, the second book of Shmuel, in chapter 10, so we have verse number 7, a certain problem arrives. So it says there, Vayishma David, Vayishlach et Yoav, ve'et kol hatzava giburim. Okay, on learning this, David sent out Yoav and the whole army, including the professional fighters. Okay, again, I don't like this translation here, but essentially means that tzva giburim. In other words, he had a small problem at first to deal with, so it was enough to send out the tzva giburim, the professional soldiers, the people who serve as soldiers all year long. Okay, but then in verse number 17, where there was an escalation, okay, and there was a need to call upon all the reserve units, so it says, Vayugad le-David, Vayesof et kol Yisrael, ויעבור את הירדן ויעבור חלימה וילכו ארם לקראת דוד וילחמו עמו. Says David was informed of it, he assembled all Israel across the Jordan and came to Elam. The Arameans drove their forces against David and attacked him. So he assembled all Israel. Okay, what does this mean? Essentially, David HaMelech, because he saw that it was going to be a larger battle, he called up all the reserve units into action. Okay, so this is essentially, it seems from these verses that the way David HaMelech ran his system, he had a base army of professional soldiers, smaller amount, and he would send them out on all the missions that they needed. You know, if there would look like a big war was coming, essentially he would call up all the reserve units, very much like the IDF does nowadays. Okay, now where do the horses tie into this? Okay, so the issue is as follows. The problem with horses are that you cannot have horses simply as reserve units. Why not? Because if somebody wants to fight with a horse, okay, again, I don't know too much about this, but you know, this is at least what I've been told and heard. You know, if you want to use the horse as an army weapon, okay, in battle, horses, chariots, etc., a person has to be very well trained on his horse, and there also has to be a connection. You know, we see often in Tanakh spoke about sus v'rochvo. You have the horse and the one who rides the horse. There has to be developed an intimate connection between the horse and his rider. Okay, it's not something that, it's not like a tank that, you know, all right, you've got your tanks in storage, call up the reserve units and you just get into the tank and drive it. People who want to be trained on horses, they essentially have to be year-long soldiers, practicing with their horses very often in olden times. The way they would do it, when they weren't fighting wars, they would practice riding the horses for purposes of hunting. And that's the way the rider and the horse would develop their relationship, and then they could use the horse for battle. So if you're essentially having an army which is very, very heavily based on a large amount of horses, that means that your army cannot be dependent on reserve units. In essence, that means that you need to have a very large regular army, people who are year-long soldiers. Okay, now, okay, so you'll ask me, so what's bad about that? What's wrong with having a very big army, which is not reserves, people who are year-long soldiers? Okay, what's the problem with that? Okay, so let's think about it.
Expense.
So very good. So first thing, if you want to have an army, which is a very large army of people who are professional soldiers, you're going to need a lot of what? Money, right? A lot of gold and silver to pay for that, right? Because it's very expensive to have people serving year-long in the army. So that leads you to the next problem, that you're going to have to somehow increase your wealth and incredibly to pay for that army. What other issues are caused by, and we'll discuss why that's a problem on its own. What other issues are there with having a very large regular army? What could it be?
Life. You don't really have much of a family life, you know.
Very good. Very good.
Your family can suffer.
Excellent. It takes people away from their families, right? Because essentially you're in the army. You're not home. You're not home where you're with your families. You're not home where you're with the elders, with all the people who can instruct you on Torah learning, on a proper spiritual life. So it's, again, it could be spiritually deteriorating. Now, there is a certain amount of people that it's necessary, but there's a difference if it's a small army or it's a huge army, okay? And if it's a huge army, then that's a significant amount of people that you're taking them away from the family and central community life, and you could be deteriorating them spiritually. What else is the problem with this very large army?
Well, one thing is you could become militaristic and aggressive in your policy. Okay,
you become more militaristic in your policy. Very good, and you start, you know, maybe doing things that you shouldn't be doing. All right, that's the third thing. Okay, anything else? Anybody want to add to that?
Could threaten the established power base because it's very convenient to plot a nice coup. Because if you haven't, during peacetime, you haven't got enough things to do. So let's conspire and replace the regime.
Okay, all right, that's another possibility. I mean, that's certainly something they always had to deal with, coups and overthrows, etc. I'll just say, because we're short on time, it also connects to what we keep saying about people believing too much in their own power. Okay? What? Because you start to see this huge army with all these horses, and again, you start to believe too much in your own power rather than the power of God. And this is something that Yeshayahu himself speaks about. That he says here, Yeshayahu in chapter 31, okay, he says, Hoi, היורדים מצרים לעזרה, על סוסים ישענו, ויבטחו על רכב קירה ועל פירשים כי עצמו מאוד, ולא שרו על קדוש ישראל ואת אדוני לא דרשו. Those who go down to Egypt for help and rely upon horses, they have put their trust in abundance of chariots, in vast number of riders, and they have not turned to the Holy One of Israel. They have not sought the Lord. So again, you'll put your faith too much in your army and in your horses and your chariots rather than in Hashem. Okay? So again,
we say,
yeah, I'm sorry?
we say that in Psalm 20, not on the, you don't rely on your sus and you don't rely on, you rely on Hashem.
Right.
Ele basusim, ele barechev, yeah.
Right. Yeah, many psukim about this.
Yeah.
Ele basusim, ואנחנו בשם השם לא נזכיר. We also have a Yeshayahu, על סוס לא נרכב, ולא נאמר. So again, the horses are a symbol for somebody putting their faith in their military power rather than in Hashem. Okay? How does this all connect to Uzziyahu? I'll just say briefly because our time is up. So we find that we don't find a large amount of horses in Uzziyahu, but we do find that he had a huge regular army. Okay, we see this in Divrei Yamim. I'll just read it briefly. It says here, Uzziah had an army of warriors, a battle-ready force, who were mustered by Yechir the scribe and Masiyah the adjunct under Hananiah, one of the king's officers. The clan chiefs valiant totaled 2,600. Under them was the trained army of 307,500, who made war with might to power and power to aid the king against the enemy. So he had a huge regular army of 300,000, over 300,000 soldiers. Okay, this is an incredible amount. Okay, in the times of Uzziyahu. So I think briefly, just very briefly, we'll discuss this more next week. But in essence, what Yeshayahu is telling them, you have an abundance of horses, not because you actually have an abundance of horses. It could be that technically they were careful. They did not go over the prohibition and it wasn't horses. But in essence, they had a very large regular army rather than having a smaller army with a large reserve unit. And that was in essence transgressing the idea of the prohibition of the abundance of horses, which is in essence a prohibition against having a very big regular army. Because again, you would have many people in the regular army away from the families. It would be very expensive, so you need to support all of this. And again, it would lead people to believe more in their own power rather than rely on Hashem. Okay, so I think this, in essence, Yeshayahu is trying to draw a parallel between the times of Shlomo and the prohibitions to a king to the time of Uzziyahu. Then says, in essence, you have exceeded with the horses. You haven't exactly exceeded with the horses, but the way you're running your army essentially is transgressing the prohibition of having too many horses. Okay, so we'll stop here. And next week we'll pick up again. Also, we'll try to understand the issue of the abundance of gold and silver, why that's problematic, how that occurred in the times of Uzziyahu, the abundance of the wines, and what the problem with that is, and how that occurred as well in the times of Uzziyahu, and try to get to the bottom down of the message of Yeshayahu here. Okay, see, somebody asked me in the chat about another place. Again, I'm not sure what verses in Tanakh you're referring to, but if you do find it, please let me know and I'll look into it. I'm not sure exactly what the reference is to. Okay. All right. Very good.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.